Many thanks to PPA for sponsoring this week's video. 10 years ago, the sheer thought of photo editing was something that riddled me with anxiety and confusion. Just the overwhelming abundance of tools available, along with the complicated user interface that most photo editing platforms adopted back then, was enough to turn me off from the entire process. But over time, I was able to slowly get around this fear and started to gain a bit of confidence and actually see improvements in my photo editing skills. But there was always something lacking that I guess it really puzzled me for quite a while. And once I figured it out, that's when things really started to click for me. And that's what I want to share with you today. So this is an image from the Dolomites, a very, very iconic scene. So this is the completely raw file. As you can see, it is definitely exposed for the sky. It is overall underexposed. So if I just hit Shift here and let's double click exposure, we'll let Lightroom automatically adjust the exposure here, which is bringing it up just a little bit more than half a stop. And if I just bring down the highlight some, and let's jack up the shadows quite a bit, maybe even bring up the white point some, maybe bring up the black point a little bit, we can see now that the overall exposure of this photograph is much more balanced. You know, we can easily see all of the detail in this photograph, which is great. And this is the way I used to go about editing photos. This is the way I see a lot of people go about editing photos, where they're just trying to make the entire scene brighter, to be able to see all the beautiful stuff happening in this photograph right here. But the problem is this, is that I started to understand the way the human eye interacts with a photograph. And generally speaking, the human eye, when you look at a photograph, you will usually your eye will travel towards the areas of the brighter exposures. In areas that are a little bit darker, those are areas of the scene that your eye kind of avoids a little bit. That's like the purpose of a vignette, if you think about it. Darken the corners, leave the center of your photograph a little bit brighter. That draws the eye into the center of your scene. So when I started to understand that, and I started to realize that when you have a photograph that looks like this after you've balanced the exposure, it looks a little bit flat. Everything has a very similar luminance value. Everything has a very similar brightness value. So there isn't certain areas that kind of command your attention, that command the viewer's eye. But once I started to realize that, okay, this is human nature. This is how a person looks at a photograph. So if I can use that information to help kind of create an optical journey, if you will, to create a little bit more separation in the photograph, a little bit more depth, because that's the big problem with photography. Photography it's a two-dimensional medium. You know, if I'm holding a photograph like a Polaroid in my hand or a print, that's a two-dimensional medium. But photography is a two-dimensional medium that is meant to capture the three-dimensional world that we live in. So how do we add that three-dimensional touch back in? And this is a great way to do it. So I'm gonna leave this image as is, and because I wanna compare another version that we're gonna create right here. So as you can see, I already put a quick edit right here just to save you a little bit of time on this photograph, but this was once again the raw photo. And I brought down the exposure almost half a stop, which is completely different than the other version, where the other version, we brought it up over half a stop. This one, we brought it down half a stop. So a one-stop difference in the overall exposure. And then the overall, you know, the basic kind of movements with highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And I brought down the texture, or brought up the texture, down the clarity, and a little bit of dehaze. But what I want to do is, knowing what we just spoke about here, we spoke about how the human eye goes towards areas of brightness, and the human eye generally avoids areas of darkness. So we're going to use that to our advantage to create a much more dynamic lighting scenario, to make a much more realistic photograph, if you will, something that more accurately resembled what it was like when I captured this photograph on location. So the very first thing I want to do is I'm going to close down the basic panel, and I'm going to come up here to the masks. Now, all of the work that we're going to do here is going to be in the masking section, which I absolutely love. And I'm going to start here with linear gradient. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it up from the bottom here to about right here. Let me drag that bottom down just a little bit further. And I'm going to bring down the exposure here and to maybe about right there we'll start with. And one of my favorite parts of this photograph is this splash of light that came through the foreground right through here. It lasted literally moments. I think I got two versions of this. One of it was out of focus because it was handheld. I was running around just trying to capture it real quick. But this one right here is in focus. It's perfectly sharp, and I got that beautiful little bit of light dancing across the foreground, which really, really pulls this photograph together. So I want to emphasize that. I want to make sure that the viewer sees this area. When I compare this version with the version we did at the beginning of the video, it's a pretty drastic difference. So I'm gonna go ahead and really bring that out. So I'm gonna bring down the exposure, maybe just a little bit more just to exaggerate it further. I'm gonna come up here to create new mask once again, and I'm gonna hit radial gradient now. And I'm gonna drag a radius, a nice, thin, narrow, big radius right across this area of light. Maybe make it a little bit more narrow to about right there, I think looks pretty good. And now I'm going to bring up the exposure in this area. Maybe even bring up the warmth a little bit just to really show off that that's sunlight hitting that area. Let's toggle this on and off. And look at what that did. I mean, that's a pretty big difference right there. And that move, or that mask, in conjunction with the one in the foreground right through here, darkening it, these right here really draws a lot of additional interest to the foreground. This is before both of those masks, after, before and after. That's a quick example of what we're gonna do to this entire photograph to make it feel more like the three-dimensional world that it existed in. So the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a new mask. I'm gonna do another radial gradient. I do this often in a lot of my photographs where I put a giant radius across the entire scene, because if you remember, the overall exposure in this photograph, we reduced it by half a stop. So we darkened the majority of this photograph because I want to be selective with where I bring back the light. So I'm going to draw, I always want to draw the viewer's attention generally into the center of the scene. This is a great way to do it. It's going to bring up the exposure a fair amount. I'm going to open up these shadows a fair amount as well to about right here. A lot of people think that if you want to increase exposure, you really just do that with the exposure slider or maybe the shadows, but using the highlights and the white point is a fantastic way to do this as well. So as I bring highlights back and forth, you can see what that's doing. It's only impacting the brighter areas where that mask is. So I'm going to bring that up a fair amount. And the same thing with the white point. When I swing this back and forth, you can see that that's also impacting just the brighter areas as well there. And a lot of times when you bring up exposure a fair amount in an area, it starts to have that kind of washed out look. You can really see it right through here. A great way to combat that is with a little bit of positive dehaze. You know, nothing crazy like that, but you know, maybe plus 15, something like that looks good. And let's toggle this on and off. So now you can really see that brought up a lot of additional attention to the center of the photograph, which is really, really nice, draws the viewer eye into perhaps the most important aspect of the scene. Now, before I carry on with the next three masks, which really kind of ties this all together, I do just want to say a big thanks to the sponsor of this week's video, which is Professional Photographers of America, or PPA for short. Now, I know I've mentioned this on quite a few occasions over the years, but one of the top reasons why I'm a member of PPA is their straightforward approach to insuring camera gear. They offer up to $15,000 worth of coverage with a $50 deductible for repairs and a $350 deductible for full replacement of equipment loss. This gives me the peace of mind knowing my gear is protected not only from damage, but also theft or any other unforeseen event that may occur. And with a PPA membership, you'll also receive data loss negligence and malpractice protection with PPA's indemnification trust, along with professional development tools designed to help you grow your skills with mentorship programs and even portfolio reviews. So join a community of over 35,000 photographers and check out the link in the description below for additional information on a PPA membership, along with a special discount as well. Now, as far as the remaining masks go, I mentioned there was it's either 3 or 4 masks left, but what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna draw some additional attention over here. There's some nice fall color over here, but as you can see, this entire area is darker. And as we mentioned earlier, areas that are generally a little bit darker, the human eye is going to avoid those areas. And I don't want that. I want to draw the person's eye, the viewer's eye, to that scene. So I'm going to bring that out by coming up here to radial gradient. We're going to do another huge radius right over here. I'm going to put the center point on the edge of the photograph, kind of rotate it down. Let's pull it all the way across here to the church right there. Maybe bring it up a little bit and kind of angle it down a touch more. We're going to bring up the exposure here. We're going to open up these shadows a touch. We're going to bring up the highlights a little bit, maybe bring up the white point a little bit. I think I'm going to make this feather a little bit less right through there. Let's actually make it bigger. A little tip too, if you want to bring out fall color, the warmth slider or the color temperature slider and bringing it more towards the warm side is a great way to do that. So we'll bring it up to about right here. We'll put in a little bit of negative or positive dehaze just to get away from that washed out look that we created by bumping up the exposure. And as we toggle that on and off, look at what a total difference that has done right there. Now, sticking with the theme of attracting attention to certain areas, obviously one of my favorite aspects of this scene, of course, is the mountains in the fall color, but the little church down here, that's kind of the star of the show. That's what's really going to lock the viewer's eye, or I should say the area of the most interest, if you will. So I really want to bring that out. It's kind of in shadow a little bit, so I want to make sure that the person who's viewing this photograph doesn't miss this all-important aspect of the scene. So I'm going to come up here to create new mask, and I'm going to use the object selection tool. I'm going to leave it on the marquee one because I like to be able to just draw a big square around it. And I'm going to highlight this entire area right here, and we'll let Lightroom go ahead and select it, which it did a very good job. Now I'm going to bring up the exposure a little bit. I want to be very careful here because I don't want to get too overdone with it. I'm going to bring up the highlights, and we'll bring up the white point a little bit like this. The shadows are starting to look a little bit cool right through there, so let's just bump up the warmth just a little bit, ever so slightly. And let's toggle this on and off. So before and after, just in an effort to make it as easy as possible for you to see at home. It's going to bring up those highlights just a little bit further, and maybe that white point a little bit further as well. Before and after, before and after. And that is a very highly targeted mask. I really, really like the way that that looks right there. And now, oops, I had that turned off and leave that on. And now I want this area right through here. This is another area where there's some beautiful fall color, but it's all in shadow right here. And I don't want to completely eviscerate all those shadows. I don't want to completely open them all the way up. I want the area to be a little bit darker, but I don't want it to be so dark because I don't want to detract the viewer from looking at this area. I want the viewer to see this area. So I'm going to go ahead and create another radial gradient in this area here, in this bottom left-hand corner. So create new mask, radial gradient once again. Let's draw a big one right over here. The reason I like to put this right on the edge is because these radial gradients, the main impact or the most concentrated area is always in the center, and then it kind of bleeds out from all edges. So by putting it right on the edge, that can ensure that I have a nice softening transition all the way from here, all the way over in this general direction. So I'm going to bring that all the way across here, make it a little bit smaller and bring it down. We're going to do a very similar treatment here. We're going to bring up the exposure, bring up highlights, bring up the white point, bring up the shadows just a touch, a little bit of positive dehaze to get away from that washed out look. And then let's warm it up quite a bit here. Look at that, such a big difference that makes in fall color. To about right here, I think is looking pretty good. I think I'm going to come back here to this right side and bring this up a little bit because I just want to make sure you can easily see it at home. And now that we've put these 6 masks on here, all of that work was done with masks and just figuring out areas where there was light transitions just to try and emphasize those areas of light and leaving areas in pure darkness that we don't want the viewer to really lock eyes on. We really want to draw the viewer's eye into the center of the scene, but most importantly, we were trying to get away from that flat look where the entire scene basically had the same luminance value or the same brightness value. We wanted to complexify the light, if you will, to make it a little bit more interesting. So now let's compare this image with the image we did in the very, very beginning. So I'm going to come up here to library. Let's go over here to the grid, shift and hit N, and look at the difference between these two photographs right here. This one right here, you can really see the difference in the foreground area. Look at this light right here. This is the exact same light, but we were really able to bring that light out. I mean, when you look at this photograph now, for me, that's where my eye goes in the very, very beginning, is right here at this light and then the church. But here, everything is the same brightness value. And that's really the power. That was kind of the aha moment for me, is when I started to realize that I can figure out, or I can dictate how a viewer looks at one of my photographs just by using exposure and just by understanding that areas that are brighter, the person's going to look at. Areas that are darker, the person's not really going to look at. So by using that to your advantage is a great way to really emphasize light and create that three-dimensional look. Because remember, photography, it's a two-dimensional art form meant to capture the three-dimensional world that we live in. So how do we bring that out? And this is a great technique. This is something that really changed the way that I go about editing photos, and it really changed the way that I even look at photographs or look at scenes in order to create a composition before I actually photograph them. So I do hope that that information was helpful. Also, before I wrap things up here, be sure to check out the link in the description below for additional information on a PPA membership today if you are interested in that. And if you have any questions about anything covered in this week's video, I know that was a lot, please leave those in the comments section below and I'll do my best to get back in touch with you as soon as humanly possible. If you have, I just said that if you have any questions, so we already went over that. But if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I know I mention it in every single video, but I really do appreciate you carving out a little bit of time to spend it with me here today. And I will see you all next Wednesday.